We are now live on Facebook, and we may begin.
Good afternoon. My name is Adnan Morshed, and I'm a professor in the School of Architecture and Catholic University of America. I would like to welcome you all to the second panel conversation of our 2021 Spring Panel Series, Speciality, Urbanity, Pedagogy in a Post-Pandemic World. In the first panel, in February, we talked about pandemic domesticity and changes in our spatial practices as a result of what seemed like a viral Armageddon last year. Today, our panel focuses on urbanity. How would cities respond to the unimaginable economic, social, public health, urban, and environmental consequences of the pandemic? It is exactly a year ago, on March 11th, the World Health Organization called COVID-19 a global pandemic. And the world came to a screeching halt. Social life was suspended, sine die. Cities became the epicenters of pandemic fear, anxiety, and claustrophobia. The spectacle of mass death and burial in Milan, Madrid, Rome, Barcelona, New York, Los Angeles, Tehran, and Mumbai not only haunted us, but also made us aware of their weaknesses in disaster preparedness, inadequacies in creating inclusive public health infrastructures, and inabilities to mitigate the social, racial, and economic inequities that plagued them. Many observers were too quick to blame urban density for the rapid viral spread and mounting COVID-19 death toll. Yet, despite Manhattan's much higher population density than that of Bronx, COVID-related death rate was much higher in Bronx. If density was the main problem, how did Hong Kong, Seoul, and Tokyo, some of the world's densest cities, manage to keep pandemic death rates astoundingly low? Was it rather the social and urban disparities between the haves and have-nots that perpetuated the vastly asymmetric suffering and death toll? Over 2 millennia ago, Plato said in the Republic, quote, "Any city, however small, is in fact divided into two. One, the city of the poor, the other of the rich. These are at war with one another," end quote. Is Plato still right in the 21st century, despite the economic, social, intellectual, and technological progress of humanity? The pandemic compels us to question some of the fundamentals of our lives, politics, societies, institutions, and most important, the norms and spatial practices in our everyday urban life. The pandemic's impact on cities was stark. Companies downsized and fewer people have been commuting, setting the stage for reckoning over new types of personal and collective priorities. The pandemic revealed existing urban pathologies and offered new opportunities for reimagining how cities ought to function. Public places suddenly became viral traps as the meanings and values of social distancing and masking up were magnified and politicized. As the pandemic-induced anxiety of being in public places made us suspicious of urban density and social proximity, cities re-evaluated the role and the quality of street amenities. Sidewalks were widened, parklets were created, streets were partially taken over as dining or hospitality space, and the value of walking and biking as forms of contactless, carbon-neutral personal mobility was rediscovered. We flocked to parks and arboreta, not gyms and stadiums. It seemed like the pandemic has re-democratized what Jane Jacobs once said about people-centric urbanity. And I quote, "There is no logic that can be superimposed on the city. People make it, and it is to them, not buildings, that we must fit our plans." In a nutshell, the pandemic is both a crisis and an opportunity. Today's panel offers us a platform to deliberate on how we mitigate the crisis and capitalize on the opportunity. Let us welcome our 4 distinguished panelists today. First up is Raymond Grindros. He's a co-founder and principal emeritus of Urban Design Associates, an international practice of urban design and architecture. Along with David Lewis, he pioneered the development of participatory planning processes for neighborhoods, downtowns, and regional plans. He's an internationally recognized advocate and veteran practitioner of what is known as architecture as city building. He led the revival of pattern books as a means of implementing urbanism. He has taught urban design at Yale University, Carnegie Mellon University, and Hampton University. He was a senior fellow at the Prince's Foundation in London, chairman of the board of the Congress for New Urbanism and the Seaside Institute, as well as a member of several boards, including the Institute of Classical Art and Architecture. He was the principal author of the Urban Design Handbook, the Architectural Pattern Book, and the Place of Dwelling. Next is Rashida Nig, who is currently serving as past president of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture, a registered architect with the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. She has practiced with firms in Georgia, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania. Her work has been funded by grants from the Pennsylvania Green Building Alliance, the Architectural Research Centers Consortium, and the Vice Provost for the Arts at Temple University. She has authored numerous papers on these topics and co-edited the book, Performative Materials in Architecture and Design. More recently, Rashida has turned her attention to the intersection of racial and environmental justice in architecture. Carl Alafante, FAIA, FAPT, is Principal Emeritus of Queen Evans, where he served as Design Principal on Architecture, Preservation, and Community Revitalization projects. Known for coining the phrase, quote, "The greenest building is one that is already built," end quote. Carl writes and lectures nationally on historic preservation, sustainable design, climate change, and urban topics. In 2018, Carl served as the 94th president of the American Institute of Architects. Carl is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and Association for Preservation Technology. Carl attended Pratt Institute School of Architecture and University of Maryland School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. He's an adjunct professor at the Catholic University of America and University of Maryland. At the University of Texas, Austin, Fernando Lara teaches seminars on 20th century Latin American architecture and urbanism, theory of architecture, and doctoral courses on decolonial methods for architectural history. Professor Lara is the editor of Latin America Thoughts, a series published by Romero Guerra Editora. He serves on several editorial boards that include Architecture and Urbanism in Las Americas, Revista DIRQ, Revista Pos, Arquitecturas del Sur, Revista Urbana. His latest publications include Excepcionalidad del Modernismo Brasileño, Modern Architecture in Latin America, and Quid Novi, both of which garnered book awards. So I welcome all of you and thank you for being here. I really appreciate your spending time with us to share your ideas for cities in a post-pandemic world. As for methodology, our panel conversation will continue for an hour, followed by a 20-minute Q&A. And I would like to request all our attendees to write your questions in Q&A of the Zoom panel, on the Zoom panel, or on Facebook Live, which Julia Prior will curate and bring it to the Q&A panel here. I now would like to invite Julia to explain how attendees can get AIA continuing education learning credits for this panel. Julia, can you explain?
Hello, my name is Julia. I'm Adnan Morshed's RA this semester. So as an attendee of today's spring panel series, Urbanity, you have the opportunity of earning AIA continuing education learning units. I will share a Google form link in the Zoom chat and also the Facebook post on CUARC's Facebook page. Please provide us with your first and last name and AIA number. If you have any questions or have trouble accessing the form, feel free to reach out via Zoom chat or Facebook comments. You will see that within the next 5 minutes. Thank you.
So without further ado, let's get started. Julia, you can unshare. Okay, great. So I want to ask our 4 panelists a general question, and please feel free to take your, take the conversation the way you deem fit. So my question a general question to all of you is that the pandemic has both exposed and magnified social inequities and our unpreparedness to tackle public health challenges in our cities. The urban poor and other minority communities suffered at a much higher rate than the affluent demography. Public places were hauntingly empty. The reduced usage of office and retail spaces has diminished the economic base of cities. Remote working appears to have permanently altered the very notion of commuting. Urban population density has been blamed for the viral spread. Cities became the epicenter of pandemic politics. Yet, the pandemic became both a crisis and opportunity. We can either radically rethink urbanity or scale up the measures of sustainable urbanism that we already have been adopting to our cities. It doesn't have to be either or. It can be both. It can be both and much more. So my question is, where are our cities going? What is the future of cities in a post-pandemic world? So that's the question I would like to address to all of you. Let's start with Ray. Ray, you want to go first? Ray, you need to unmute.
Sure, I'd be happy to start. Thank you very much, Adnan, for this opportunity. Well, I think you're placing this as both a disaster and a disaster that provides an opportunity is a very effective way of couching the discussion. I was reminded of an experience a number of years ago at a different disaster, a regional one. In the wake of the terrible hurricanes Rita and Katrina, Louisiana was terribly devastated with enormous amount of damage. A program called Louisiana Speaks was started, funded by several foundations. And they, interestingly enough, had the motto, "Building Back Better," which I'm excited to hear has been a call of the Biden administration. And it called together various planners and urban designers to come up with ways of addressing longstanding problems that could be overcome in the process of rebuilding. And the most essential aspect of it was in the name Louisiana Speaks, because the emphasis was on intense civic engagement across the entire region of southern Louisiana, so that recommendations for regional vision, charrettes in individual places for revitalization, the development of a pattern book and a planning toolkit were all done with input and participation from the people who were most affected by it. Another motto of that time was "Don't waste a crisis." And I think that's our mission here, is to not waste this opportunity. As you pointed out, there have been some very interesting things happening in response to the crisis, and I'd like to illustrate just one. In Norfolk, Virginia, there is a program called Open Norfolk, which was established by the local business community, the Downtown Norfolk Council, and the city of Norfolk, and a firm called Work Program Architects led the effort. And it was to try to help businesses reopen. Now, as happened in every other city, it became clear that restaurants needed to have seating in the outdoors. Difficulty in downtown Norfolk is that the sidewalks are narrow. And so, like in other places, the parking spaces on the street were commandeered to become parklets and cafes and outdoor dining rooms. So what do you do about the parking? Well, fortunately, there's a parallel street, one block to the west, which had 2 lanes in each direction in its configuration with a median in the middle. And so the program commandeered the 1 lane in each direction and transformed it into a combination bike lane and parking. So that's the situation, but the lesson here, it seems to me, is in the fact that that 4-lane street had been a problem for 35 years, that the community and the city had tried to mitigate by slowing traffic. It was too much traffic going at too high a speed through a critical place where a neighborhood joins the downtown. In past efforts to tame that street, various groups would predict the end of any business in downtown because traffic would be blocked. It was thought that the hospital would go out of business, which was approached in part by that street, or even the university, which was 5 miles away, would be hurt by closing that street. So in a crisis, it all happened in a matter of a week or two. The safety cones went up to close off the lanes. Then lines were painted. And of course, traffic was reduced during the peak of the pandemic. So there was no traffic congestion, but traffic was slowed. The street became civilized. The 2 sides of the street were much easier to move back and forth. Came even more apart downtown, and the downtown restaurants that opened on the sidewalk prospered more because of the pedestrian connections. In other cases, parking lots, which had been mandated by zoning for restaurants in urban neighborhoods, parts of them were turned into cafes and outdoor dining. The restaurants now do not want those to go back to parking lots because their business improved so tremendously. And they felt that by having the presence of people dining outdoors, it's a kind of marketing for it. So these are two little examples of how taking advantage of a crisis can bring about substantive change in the quality of urban life and urban space. These inequities that have been revealed, it seems to me we as planners and architects and urban designers need to focus on what it is that we can do in the physical world to be able to do that. Our neighborhoods and our cities once were designed in such a way that everything was interconnected. The whole idea of the American grid is that it's a democratic grid with every door connected to every other door. And the neighborhoods traditionally had a mix of different types and cost and style of housing so that they were there was natural economic integration. You could start out life with very little money, and as you prospered, move to a bigger house. And then when you retired, move to an apartment building. So there was also long-term community stability. And then in the course of the 20th century, of course, a whole series of zoning policies, some of which were based on efforts to preserve segregation, racial segregation and economic segregation, destroyed the concept of mixed income type neighborhood. Highways and roads cut up the grids so it was no longer an interconnected one. Various types of well-meaning housing programs created large complexes at both low income and high income, which were islands unto themselves, so that we wind up with a fragmented, alienating, segregated society. We, I think, have the opportunity now, just like the transformation of the street I mentioned in Norfolk, to begin to reconnect the grids and re-establish these traditions if we can somehow seize the opportunity. And I think the changing in work habits means that probably neighborhoods are going to become more like downtowns, and downtowns will become more like neighborhoods with mixes of uses. These are new opportunities for revitalizing our urban patterns, and I hope we're all able to do it.
Thank you, Ray. Who wants to jump in next? Rashida, you want to go next?
Sure. Thanks, Adnan. And I'd like to just thank you for the opportunity to join you this evening. It's really a pleasure to engage in this timely discussion. As you mentioned in your opening question, the pandemic has certainly revealed the embedded inequities baked into the urban fabric of our society. And in my opinion, the future of cities in a post-pandemic world will need to address both the vulnerabilities of urban life as demonstrated by the spread of disease such as COVID-19, and also the long-term and persistent problem of structural racism. Of the two, the COVID crisis is undoubtedly the easier to address. More open space, parks, fresh air within buildings, reduced occupancies, the examples that Ray just provided in Norfolk in terms of rethinking the use of public space. But it'll be far more difficult to re-envision urban life while also adopting more equitable and just patterns. It's worth noting that historically, the types of amenities that seem to be called for in a post-pandemic city have also led to the displacement of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. Too often, the arrival of a new or renovated park, greenways, also accelerate gentrification that pushes the poor and people of color to less desirable areas. If we look to examples of climate gentrification, a phrase coined in a study by Harvard researchers a few years ago, who evaluated the increased value of higher elevation land in Miami, while the value of waterfront properties declined, it's clear that our urban design strategies must also be viewed through a social justice lens. The increase in property values in the higher elevation communities such as Little Haiti and Liberty City that were historically occupied by people of color due to policies of redlining now have an affordable housing problem. Poor people of color are being driven out by developers. Similar effects have been observed in urban greening, where working class and the poor are forced out of neighborhoods after the installation of mitigation strategies to increase the resilience of a community. So often the most vulnerable in our society are actually not protected by policies that are intended to improve the quality of life for all. We need to learn from this history as we consider the post-pandemic city. Returning to the current issues of COVID-19 pandemic and the intersection with systemic racism, I'd just like to highlight a few statistics. According to the CDC, as compared to whites, American Indian and Alaskan Native populations experienced 3.7 times the hospitalization rate and 2.4 times the death rate. Blacks experienced almost 3 times the hospitalization rate and nearly double the death rate, while Latinx experienced about the same, 3.1 times the hospitalization rate and 2.3 times the death rate. These disparities have been attributed to socioeconomic status that limit one's access to healthcare and increase their exposure to the virus due to occupations that make it more difficult for them to self-isolate and work from home. Being poor is a public health risk, and about 1 out of 4 Native Americans live in poverty, and 1 out of 5 Blacks live in poverty today. To meet the ethical imperative to create more healthy cities, architects and planners must also foster justice and equality. We must reposition our relationship to the city. And in my opinion, it means that we must also intentionally shift power and agency to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and to the poor, to those that typically don't have the financial or social access to hire architects as clients. But if we are called to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public, we are also called to mitigate the health effects of poverty and to dismantle systems of racial oppression, the effects of which are currently built into the very fabric of our cities. So I guess I will close repeating the old adage that Ray just mentioned in his remarks. Let's not waste the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashida. Carl or Fernando, who wants to go next?
I can jump in.
Okay, Fernando.
I could not agree more with Rashida. Julia, can you show my first image, those slides that I sent? Yes, thank you. So I will take you guys 500 years ago in order to address the issues of social and environmental inequality that we have today. 500 years ago, almost exactly, my ancestors, Spanish and Portuguese, took the city of Tenochtitlan, Mexico City. It was in 1521. And it is no coincidence that our discipline, architecture, was developing the methods and the means to manipulate space at the same time that my ancestors, first the Spanish and Portuguese, and I have both in my family tree, and soon later the French, the British, the Dutch, they crossed the ocean and colonized our continent. And it's also no coincidence that if you look at the map of the world today, the places that had the worst response for COVID are in the Americas. It's my native Brazil, my adopted land of the United States. Mexico is also not very well. Peru is not doing very well. what's going on in the Americas that we have the worst response to a crisis like COVID. Like Adnan was asking in the beginning, Hong Kong, Tokyo, Seoul, African cities are much, much poorer than Sao Paulo or Los Angeles or Guadalajara, and they fared better. So there's something here. There is something deep into our constitution as a society that made us respond so poorly. And I will address the issue of density later, but first let me start with the possibility, with the idea that architecture is a tool for colonizing, that when we draw, when we anticipate spaces, we are somehow colonizing those spaces. My recent work went back to the 16th century to demonstrate that the process of abstraction is exactly the same in cartography and in architecture. What happened in the 16th century, and that's why I have this illustration here, is that Europeans were able to manipulate space by removing people, by removing the relation that people have on spaces and manipulating spaces in the abstract. It's precisely our very process of organizing space in plan, section, elevation. It's a process of removal. Now, who is removed? If you go back to René Descartes or Leibniz I mean, Bacon, so many of the 17th and 17th century European philosophers, European men, white men, are equated with reason. Everybody else, non-man or non-European, are equated with emotions, therefore removed from the conversation. So when we look at the numbers that Rashida showed us a few minutes ago about how the COVID pandemic fared much, much worse with people of color in the Americas, it goes back to that tradition of 500 years of colonization. Now we all have independent nations, but the epistemic colonization continues. The idea that only the North have knowledge, that only the North have the means, that the global South has culture. We need to flip that equation. We need to look at knowledge in the Amazon. We need to look at knowledge in the Chiapas, Mexico. We need to look at knowledge in South India or North Africa or in the Philippines. And we need to look at our own culture on how have we been unable to protect our own neighbors. So I'm sorry, I have to disagree with Ray. I don't see anything democratic in the grid. The grid was always an instrument of colonization and control. And if it was democratic, it was for one group of people only, one religion, one skin color, one language. And we need to take a really deep look at ourselves and try to understand why we let 500,000 of our neighbors die in the last 1 year. And it's on the US only. If you add Brazil, it's another 270,000 people. And I don't have the numbers for the other countries in the Americas. It's just too painful. It's just too dramatic. In a way, very similar to the pandemics of the 16th century that obliterated the original population of the Americas. We have to take a look at that and try to understand what kind of society we built, what kind of society we built that people are comfortable not wearing masks in public or in the streets or in the gathering. They kind of know who's gonna die. They kind of know who's gonna have access to an ICU unit and who's not. What's going on here? And most important for us, to understand the role of architecture, our own discipline, into building this very unequal, very unsustainable society. I will just wrap up with the issue of density because Adnan asked us to comment on density and how density relates to COVID, and just to help us separate two very different kinds of density. We have the density of Manhattan, the density of an area where the square footage is very expensive, and you have very small families living in each unit and having to share an elevator for sure, a lobby of the building for sure, but mostly having enough space inside the unit for everybody to be okay. And then we have the density of East LA, the density of Mexico City, the density of some parts of Sao Paulo, the density of South Chicago, where you have 5 people sleeping in the same bedroom. If you look at the density of South Chicago or East LA, it's lower than the density of Manhattan. And the families in Manhattan, the ones who can afford to live in the south part of Manhattan, they have floors and ceilings and insulation between each living unit. The density of South Chicago or East LA or some parts of Austin, close to where I live, is that you have 7 people in a bedroom and they have nothing to separate from each other when one of them gets infected with COVID or with the flu or with a regular whooping cough or pink eye or anything. So I will stop here. I see that the chat is already full of questions answering to my provocation, and I will be happy to elaborate more a few minutes later. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. So, Carl, it's your turn now.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm glad that I'm getting to go last year because I just got all psyched up by listening to everybody else. So you woke me right up here. Well, Adnan, thanks very much for the invitation, and it's really a pleasure to be part of this panel. Really happy to be here today. So I want to switch lenses here a little bit and say, let's stop talking about the symptoms and let's start talking about the disease. And that, you know, so the pandemic is an understandable, anticipated result of climate change. It's an understandable, anticipated result of the way that human beings are living on the earth. We've stirred it up. We've sort of created the conditions to cause a situation like this. And, you know, just to really be simple about it, it is part of the global urbanization mega pattern that is happening in this century. What will happen in this century is this is the century of urbanization, that as the century dawned, more than half of the people in the world were living in urban situations. And by century's end, the UN estimates that nearly 9 in 10 people are going to live in cities. So whatever the human condition is, will be the condition that we create in cities. So that's what we need to be understanding, and the pandemic is part of that, as are global inequity issues, the urban inequity issues that come with it, and so on. So how do we go from the symptoms of climate change and pandemic and social inequities and resource depletion and so on to really be thinking about what the big frame is, what the real disease is that we need to be addressing? And in essence, we've had a number of things that have referenced it, but it's that we are in the Anthropocene era. We are now in an era that there are so many people using so many resources and living on the earth so insensitively that now we are literally changing the earth that our life depends on and that all other life depends on as well. And that is something that we've known about since Rachel Carson publishing her Silent Spring in 1962 and talking about the systemic effects, that it wasn't just people polluting, but that the pollution was to the point where it was having systemic effects on nature. And so that's really the context that we need to be framing this specific question in, of what is the impact of this post-pandemic world. And I think if you look at the kind of history of what has happened with previous crises, we're sort of well on our way to wasting this crisis. We've done it time and time and time again, and we're going to probably do it again this time unless we really change our mode of acting. I think the good news is there's a lot of understanding about how big a transition point we face. And it's not just because of the pandemic. It's not just because of climate change. It's not just because of social and economic inequity, but it's literally the sum total of all of those things coming together. There's been a lot of ink spent on that. And I would just point back to 2015, 2016, when over the course of literally a year, the UN had 3 different summits that sort of find this. And of course, the one that is probably most known is the Paris Agreement, the Paris Summit, where the climate agreement was signed. But a few months before that was a summit in New York City where the 17 Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. And then just a few months after Paris was the Habitat 3 in Quito, Ecuador, where the new urban agenda was signed. And when you take those together, I just point to that and say, it's right there. It is. It's written. This framework, we should understand this framework. And I just want to mention that that's not the only time that it's ever been framed. There's a lot of other, okay, that's the UN, that's all those people that are just a bunch of bureaucrats. Why should we listen to them? Well, this exact same framework was created in 2011, between 2007 and 2011, by the then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen. And okay, serious thinker. How about the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff looking at the security of the country in those terms? And it's exactly the same framework of basically them saying, we are trying to solve 21st century problems with 20th century thinking. We really need to understand the difference of where we are today. And I just want to mention a couple of other kind of specifics here and the role of architects in this. I think that a couple of things that have already been said today, and actually Adnan, in your introduction as well, probably the most essential thing that is a problem with where our current civilization is, our current way of building cities and making buildings is, and creating the conditions for all human interchange. That's what we do. We create the conditions for all human interchange. That probably the most fundamental thing is our relationship with nature is broken. We've forgotten that we're part of nature. We've forgotten our own nature is part of nature, and that disconnect is so total. It's so interesting as well that it's one of the big reconnects that you get through indigenous cultures, which are not, many of them are not disconnected from the earth as much. And I just want to remind us all that, do you know where the concept of organic came from? Frank Lloyd Wright came from an architect talking about creating an essential realignment of how we think about the built environment in its relationship to the natural environment. And, Frank Lloyd Wright had his own interpretation. There's a lot of people that have had their own interpretation since then. But, it's really, that disconnect is something that, architects for a century now have been asking themselves, what do we do to sort of make that reconnect? And I just want to go back to the pandemic with one specific example, kind of following Ray's lead on this. And that is the apartment building development idea that exists in mostly Canada, with Toronto and Vancouver, I would point to specifically. The idea of narrow, tall buildings being the solution to what urban density needs to look like. And why did they have that? In a pre-pandemic world, their notion was that every apartment would be a corner apartment, that every building would have floors with 4 apartments on it, one in each corner, and that would provide solar access for everyone. It would provide cross ventilation for everyone. It would provide an ability to really, be exposed to the outside. And I think that with the pandemic, just things like an apartment that doesn't have a door that can open out onto an outside space, is that really a living unit that's acceptable post-pandemic? I would actually argue that it's not, that the idea of anybody living in a place where they don't have access to the outside without having to get into an elevator or whatever, or get onto a subway and get to it, that's sort of a human right. And you begin to see this with things even as awful as the current era of housing in China. But you see that this notion that everybody ought to have a balcony, everybody ought to have solar access, et cetera. So I do think that in our post-pandemic world, it's a symptom of our awakening to the urban era that we're in, and the need to really understand that our job is to create the conditions that all human interchange is going to happen in. If it's going to be equitable, it's because we are going to make that a defined goal. If it's going to be healthy, it's because we're going to make that a defined goal. So it's really redefining what we as architects should be thinking about. And the post-pandemic is giving us a crisis that I hope we won't waste.
Okay. Thank you, Carl. Thank you all for your kind of opening statements. So in the second round, I would like to go back to each of you with one question before we turn to Q&A. So my first question, kind of tailored question to each of you, begins with Ray. So Ray, I want to ask you a question about the historicity of pandemics and how it affected the way we thought about cities. So the birth of modern urban planning, as we all know, is deeply tied to 19th century awareness of the urgent need of health and sanitation in the industrial city, like London or New York or Paris. The epidemic of cholera in mid-19th century London gave birth to modern sewage infrastructure and a host of reform movements, housing reform, and so on. Parks were created as an antidote to disease. The Thames stopped being an open sewer after some proactive laws and interventions. In New York, Jacob Riis's book, How the Other Half Lives, exposed the brutality and disease-ridden world of the working-class New Yorkers. The publication of How the Other Half Lives shook the conscience of America. Yet, cities have a history of bouncing back. So my question to you, Ray, is, can you think of a new generation of challenges that our cities may face in a post-pandemic world? And in answers to those questions, we can actually create a better world, and create better cities. Ray, can you unmute?
Yes, now I think it works.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to answer that question, if you don't mind, in a fairly roundabout way. I think history has two kinds of lessons. Lessons of what to do and lessons what not to do. And certainly the ones you pointed out are ones that had all very good results. And I would suggest that there is a basic quality to life in cities, particularly in towns, that is not just concerned with the physical form or with issues of sanitation and health. There is the whole sense of urbanity, of creating places where there is a strong sense of community, where people are capable of building social capital, which brings a whole about stability. The nature of urban life is one that brings people together. And that's less quantifiable than sunlight and air and sanitation. And there are examples that took the desire for sunlight and air to such an extreme that all questions of urbanity were eliminated. The first stage of some good examples, clearly George and London and the Newtown and Edinburgh examples of bringing nature into the city and still preserving some element of urbanity. In the 19th century, I would argue that the Garden Cities movement, while it produced some charming and pleasant environments, was fundamentally anti-urban because it began the process of segregating uses, of separating different functions of the city and focusing on that as a form for, as the basis of regional form. And in the 20th century, the modernist movement, as a reaction to all of the terrors and problems of the traditional city, produced a set of forms which have created a whole series of social problems. The German social housing complexes were certainly a response to both the social philosophy, political philosophy, and lifestyle of that country. When they were brought here into American society, they were in the form of public housing, which, when it takes the notion of simply dealing with sanitary housing, sunlight, and air, creates an environment that lacks some of the essential qualities of urban space that foster a sense of community. And of course, some of the extreme examples, not just in this country, but in other places in which building plans were developed with absolutely rigid configurations of identical blocks, fine for sunlight and air, but without the potential for active community space and street life and urban life on the ground. So I think it's important as we deal with these issues to keep both sides of that equation in mind. I was, of course, Carl mentioned Rachel Carson and her book from 1961. Jane Jacobs' book was also 1961. And there's another book that has changed my life, which is less well known, which is Slums and Social Insecurity by Alvin Shore, who was a social worker and also HEW official at one point and a university professor. Curiously, he was a visiting professor at Catholic University in the late 1970s. And he posits the argument that there is a causal relationship between the physical form of environment and a person's capacity for upward social mobility in two ways, one of which is he called the dwelling as mirror of self, which was, I believe he coined that phrase, others have used it since, that challenges all of us who are designing housing and buildings to keep in mind the people we're designing for and the aspirations of those people. That's part of the reason I felt so strongly throughout my career that meaningful dialogue with the people with whom we're working, people who live in the communities, was the most important thing, to be able to understand what aspirations, what people's aspirations are. And designing the housing. And the second part had to do with the degree to which people understand the structure and form of the city has a direct relationship to their capacity to succeed in life, because he makes a distinction between block dwellers and city dwellers. City dwellers being those who use the city and gain access to all the opportunities that they have, that the city offers with ease and with comfort, so that they can make their way forward in fulfilling their life's ambitions. These qualities, it seems to me, are essential if we're going to create an equitable, if we're going to create an environment that supports the creation of an equitable society. And I understand Fernando's point about the grid, and I use it as a general term for the interconnectedness of cities, because with an interconnected city in which you are able to get easily from one place to another, you have that access. So I would say that and I'm intrigued with Carl's Canadian towers. I think they're marvelous. And many of the examples that I've seen, when they come down to the ground, there's a whole world at the ground level of lower scale structures that create the urban spaces that animate, that provide the framework for people's lives and provide the framework for community. I just feel that it's important we keep all of these elements in balance. And my concern, I'm very excited about some of the resilience designs, and we're involved in a couple here in Norfolk of trying to deal with tidal flooding and stormwater management by creating public open spaces of various sorts designed to manage the water. And it can produce a very beautiful environment. I'm concerned with singleness of focus, which we as a profession seem to have done in the past, where we respond to one crisis and then another crisis and another, forgetting the holistic nature of cities. There are whole places that are where people live and carry out their lives, establish networks of social connections. And it's important for us to keep all of those humane qualities also in our forefront. And the best way I think I know of doing that is to make sure whatever we're involved with, we actually sit face to face with the people who are going to be living in or who live in the community in which we're working.
Thank you, Ray. Rashid, I want to come back, return to you. And I want to ask you, I'm intrigued by the whole debate about density during the pandemic time in the past 1 year. Do you think it is density or the lack of investment in the city's public health infrastructure, such as healthcare facilities, parks, sidewalks, trees, public places, and accessibility, water management, etc., that amplify the pandemic's adverse effects on urban population, practically the minority communities? We all know that what redlining did to American cities since the 1930s. Redlining was a huge thing. It was a discriminatory tool that was abundantly applied to American cities. How do we ensure that social distancing remains a public health safety tool, not the catalyst for a new generation of exclusionary planning instrument? Will people leave cities for the suburbs and countryside, creating new types of discriminatory urban boundaries and anti-urban politics? So I want to hear from you. I want to get a sense of your position on the new generation of redlining that can emerge out of the notion of social distancing.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that question, but I think one, I'd like to start by really talking about what do we mean when we define city? When we say city, what are we really trying to say? And I think there are multiple types of city, you know, of urban environments. And often, you know, I'm going to just talk about two. There's the city that's the vibrant place of culture and museums and living and working and playing together, and this kind of vibrant diversity and walkable neighborhoods and public transit and parks. But there also is the kind of inner city that's often described in a way in kind of code language, which means, you know, urban blight, and it means crime, and it means all kinds of kind of negative connotations. So we kind of use that word city often in a really interchangeable way without actually defining what and who we're talking about. So when you think about social distancing and its impact on the future of cities, I think it's really important that we don't do that through a colorblind lens. It's not a colorblind lens that we live in society. I'm not seen in a colorblind way. None of us are. So there are people that have access to privilege and to power and to money that allow them a level of mobility that was displayed in the pandemic. There were people who were able to flee Manhattan to a second home, to flee the kind of density that was thought to be potentially harmful for the spread of the COVID-19. And but most Black people, most people of color, Indigenous people, people living in poverty do not have that same mobility. So they live in the places that other people don't want to live. They live on land that's devalued. So to return to Carl's thought about just looking at the kind of broader picture of climate, I think we also have to look at climate equity and justice. And if we reframe that discussion more broadly through the lens of social justice, through the lens of racial justice, we're going to begin to understand that these issues are completely intersectional. And there are so many people in our society that do not have a voice, that are not empowered by design review panels and other things that we do to kind of get community input, and that we have to really understand the true social impact of all of our designs, not just the impact, you know, of engaging the client, but as Ray's saying, really engaging everyone who's impacted by the designs that we make or the plans that we make for a city, which means that we have to not only prioritize the people who are hiring and paying us, but actually understanding the ultimate impact of what we do on the world, not only in terms of sustainability, climate change, resilience, but also in terms of who is gaining power and privilege and who is losing it in terms of the impact of the projects that we have. So I'll just conclude with this one thought. There is growing awareness that the root causes of climate change are very similar to the root causes of racial oppression. That as soon as we begin to devalue some parts of the planet, we're also devaluing the people that live there. So this kind of collective willingness to create these hierarchies that devalue people of color also allow us to neglect the resources that we depend on to sustain all forms of life and ultimately hurt all of us. So as long as we're able to be okay with certain people having power, privilege, mobility, and other people being kind of shifted into parts of the city, parts of the world, parts of land that are devalued, we are actually harming all of us. So I think what needs to be done is we need to really understand the full impact of what we build on the world and on all people. And if we're not willing to do that, we don't have systems that do that right now. And if we're not willing to actually embrace more holistic views of our impact on society, I agree with Carl that this is a crisis that's already being wasted.
Thank you, Rashida. I think one point that you mentioned is foundational, is the agency of each community. The community, the right to speak, the right to voice their concerns, and in the whole narrative of creating a better world must be understood, must be prioritized. So in other words, all narratives must be considered in creating a better world. I think that's foundational. Agency of each community. Maybe it's a minority community or a majority community, doesn't matter. In order to create a sustainable, holistic, sustainable world, we must hear all voices. I think, Rashida, that's what you are referring to in some ways, that we must hear to all narratives. I want to ask one question, pose one question to both Carl and Fernando, is that I want to kind of, bring in the notion of what history can teach us. The birth of modern urban planning is deeply tied to 19th century awareness of the kind of the urgent need of health and sanitation in the industrial city. The epidemic of cholera in mid-19th century London gave birth to modern sewage infrastructure and a host of other housing to environmental reform movements. Parks were created as an antidote to disease, Central Park and other parks in Europe. The Thames stopped being an open sewer. In New York, Jacob Riis's book, How the Other Half Lives, exposed the brutality and disease-ridden world of the working class New Yorkers, which the exposure, the revelation of which shook the conscience of America. Yet, cities have a history of bouncing back. So my question to both of you is that, can you think of a new generation of challenges that our cities may face in a post-pandemic world? How do we respond to them?
I think I can try. I want us to pay attention to how we tell stories, especially how we tell stories about ourselves. So we tell the story that modern urbanism came from the 19th century improvement of the science of sanitation and the science of contamination, and that urbanists responded to that. We don't often tell the story that the same science of sanitation and contamination was very much infused with scientific racism. The idea from the 19th century that people could read your propensity to be a criminal by the size of your nose and other stupid things like that. But that's a significant part of our history. It's a significant part of how our ideas developed, and it's a significant part of how cities came to be so segregated. And I think going back to something that Ray was mentioning before, my hope for a better future is a future with way more participation. I think participation and agency are the key issues here. we're gonna have to reshuffle, reconceptualize the role of the architect. We're gonna have to dismantle this idea of a genius creator that sits down to draw a beautiful world that then can modify people's behavior and that a better society will come out of it. I'm sorry, no better society will come out of the drawings of a single person. A better society will come out from a lot of struggle, a lot of protest, a lot of fight, a lot of organization, and a lot of agency. And we architects will have to absorb that into our practices. I see hope in my students. I think the students of today are way more interested in collective authorship, for instance. They don't care about this big name here or the big name there. They care about different processes that can engage communities and kind of propose a better built environment. That said, I still believe that we do have the responsibility and the power to envision a better world. We have that power. We can draw better cities. We have, for instance, I think Ray was mentioning how we can take over space that the 20th century gave to cars. We can take that space back. We can draw that and propose that. But to really achieve a better society in generations to come, we'll have to reconsider the role of the architect, how we tell the stories about ourselves, and be open and be willing to work much more as one more participant in a big struggle of society at large.
Thank you, Fernando. So I think we are almost coming to the end of our panel conversation. But very quickly, I want to ask a question to Fernando. Fernando, do you want to quickly respond to how Latin American cities, although Latin American cities are by no means a monolithic concept. Do you want to kind of very quickly respond to how Latin American cities are faring during the pandemic times, particularly public transportation, when there is a kind of inherent a fear of social proximity, kind of social, public transport is, after all, a collective concept. How is that evolving in a post-pandemic world? If you could respond to that in a very, kind of a succinct answer.
No, I'll talk about Brazil only because that's the place that I know best and that I have more information, more data about. Public transportation ridership in Brazil was already declining. The apps like Uber and Lyft were already taking a big dent of the ridership of public transportation. So it was already in crisis because the number of people using public transportation was already declining. And I think the pandemic is the last nail of the coffin of an investment in public transportation. What's happening right now, you can imagine, is that everybody that have the means to pay for an Uber, maybe with somebody from their bubble or somebody from their family, is doing so. And only the people who have no means at all are taking public transportation. And that's very problematic because you do have still lots of people sharing space together. And in the case of Brazil, you have a president very much like the one we had last year, not encouraging the use of masks, not encouraging the use of social distancing. So you have the perfect storm in Brazil. Economic stagnation, a federal government that does not support the right measurements, and a public transportation system that was already strained by declining numbers of people, and now it's absolutely just collapsing.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Fernando. So I think we have that's the time we have for our panel conversation. And now I would like to invite my colleague Tonya Onstad to curate the questions that have been building momentum in our chat room. So Tonya, are you here? Can you reveal yourself? Tonya, thank you. Thank you for being here. Do you want to kind of take, can you see the questions or comments?
Yeah, I have to pop back in. Nice to meet everyone. Thank you for having me. Of the 3 panel series, this is the one I feel like I am the least comfortable in the water. So thank you all for inviting me up there. There's a lot of questions. And so I think one of the interesting things about these panel series is to see or to hear the conversation. You've all been really eloquent. And I think maybe while I read through these, I would like to just ask a first question, kind of riffing off of Adnan's. But so what do you guys think is sort of, what would be the easiest thing that we could do to harness, sort of to make change during this pandemic? What do you think is sort of the lowest hanging fruit? I have an idea of what I think we should all hire more people that look like the world we live in. So a more diverse hiring and working practice. But that's just my first thought, taking the lowest fruit here. Good. Anyone else?
So Tanya, this is Carl. I'm going to answer that in a little different way, and that is, let's not forget what else is going on in the world. Okay, and over the course of the last couple of years, actually literally just the last year, we've seen the Congress step up and say, okay, here's $1 trillion for this, here's $1 trillion for that, related to the kind of COVID response. And that is a drop in the bucket compared to the money that is going to be spent over the next 2 decades to decarbonize the world. Everything about the built environment, everything about transportation, everything about industry, everything about agriculture. And, there's a lot of different things that you can reference about, well, what does that really look like? But it's literally at least $100 trillion undertaking that is being launched. And, this fall, the world is going to meet again in Glasgow, Scotland, and do the 5-year update from Paris and talk about how are we going to spend this $100 trillion over the next 2 decades to decarbonize. I think whatever we talk about, whatever we want to accomplish, if we're not going to make it part of the $200 trillion decarbonization of the world, it's not going to happen. So if you want to have a more equitable community, figure out how to have it be part of that $100 or $200 trillion investment in decarbonization. If you want to have a healthier community, figure out how to make it be part of that $100 or $200 trillion decarbonization. So I think that to me, the absolute kind of the next 20 years that we just have to keep in mind that is what we need to associate ourselves with. And I'll give an example of the post-World War II era, where there were a huge kind of engine of development was happening all around the world, and literally architects modernized the world in just a couple of decades. Happened unbelievably quickly that every city ended up looking like 50-story towers, clad in glass and so on. So that sort of that kind of wave is happening, and so I think it's really this is the COVID crisis is this little blip at the beginning of this bigger crisis, which is called the climate crisis. And, so how do we associate the things that we want to accomplish to make the world a better place, that the way that Adnan has stated it a number of times today, and I think is exactly the right framework to that effort? Because if we don't, we will be left at the sidelines.
Anyone else? I want all of the attendees, or not attend, anyone who's here, could you please go ahead and shoot your questions in the chat so I can bring them up or bring them forward.
I would just add a kind of counter perspective about the post-World War II era, because that was the same time that we began to institute public programs that actually allowed for redlining and for segregation of neighborhoods that previously weren't segregated. So the real challenge here is actually not just to do what Carl is saying, but it's how. And it's who do you engage in the process and how do you evaluate success? And there are a lot of people for a lot of years that looked at the way that our cities and even our urban and suburban regions developed and said that this was successful. And we talked about, I mean, I think that Adnan talked about Jane Jacobs in his opening statement, and there were many things that in Jacobs' work that were actually wonderful in terms of the way she understood cities to be involved, to evolve. But she also looked at cities in a very colorblind way. And there are many people that were left out of that dialogue. So I would go back to what Fernando just said a moment ago about, collective engagement. And I would say meaningful collective engagement of all people, not just who we define to be stakeholders, to be really important. Because if we isolate any of these issues and don't look at them in an intersectional way, we may meet our measures of success and still be largely unsuccessful.
Just another thought about what to do now. I agree with both Carl and Rashida's observations. I think maybe one thing to do is to really look at the various things that have happened already in response to the pandemic, the taking over of streets for other uses, the using of open space in different ways, the changes in work patterns, the changes in medical practice that are going on. But in terms of the physical environment, those things that have helped break down some of the stone walls to positive change, look at them and see them as a kind of wave, a series of waves that can be ridden. The second point, I believe what Carl is saying to be very, very true. And in this city of Norfolk, where I now live, we're I think we're the second most endangered city in the United States because of tidal rise. And the initiatives that have happened here have been ones that engage the communities. And the emphasis has been how to respond to the specific challenge of water management, which is what the tidal flooding and stormwater, groundwater management are all about, but to solve them not just by solving that problem, by seeing in public processes how that challenge and the kinds of devices that need to be used can be used towards a greater social purpose that serves the communities that are affected by them. Water in this region, well, it's true all over the world, but in this region, water affects everybody because the land is so low and the pattern of tidal inlets is so universal in the city. that everyone is aware of water and what it can do. And so riding, this is not an intended pun, riding the going and dealing with environmental possibilities in a way that we always look to see if it can resolve many issues and serve many purposes rather than just one.
So I have another question of my own, but I should clearly look at the chat. So I want to ask there's a couple of interesting questions here. James asks, Carl, how is global warming the cause of neither a natural animal to human mutation of a disease or a laboratory manufactured and accidentally released mutation of a disease? Maybe I should reword this. I think he's asking how global warming is the cause of the pandemic.
So if you look at the things that have been identified as things that will be an effect of global warming, there are 8 of them that are on the list of potentials that are related to human health. Okay, pandemic is one of them. And, there's a whole series of things that go behind that with, changes of the conditions in which those organisms are growing, changes in conditions in which the humans are interacting with other animals, et cetera, et cetera. So I can't tell you COVID and what that specifics are, what conditions changed or whatever, but pandemic is, one of those things that's on the list of human health consequences from global warming. The one other thing that I would add to that is that, COVID's the pandemic that's certainly getting all the attention today, but, there have been epidemics and pandemics about since 2000 with the Ebola and SARS and MERS and so on. That you can map this. This is happening more quickly now. So there's something that's going on that is a concern here that is kind of anticipated by scientists studying the effects on biology of warming trends. So I hope that's enough of an answer.
We got a good question here from a distinguished panelist. From Adnan, what is the future of public transportation in the post-pandemic world? This is interesting.
I will try to answer that, Adnan. I think public transportation is a perfect picture. It's a perfect recording of the layers of privilege that we have in society today. I don't need to use public transportation. I have the privilege of working from home. I don't even need to take an airplane and fly to DC anymore, because now we have naturalized the fact that it's okay to have our conversations over Zoom. So I have the gigantic privilege of being at home as much as possible until the vaccine reached me last week. So now public transportation for many, many people in Chicago, in New York, in LA, in Sao Paulo, in Bangladesh, in Mumbai, in China, will be, if we don't change the inequality structure of late capitalism, will be one more layer of burden on those that cannot stay at home and work remotely. I'll stop right here. That's all I want to say.
Can I just add one thing, and that is that, we talked a little bit about density and how it really isn't reflected the American situation, and in fact, for that matter, the Western Hemisphere situation is not universal. And this is actually another thing where if you look at what's going on in Tokyo, what's going on in Seoul, what's going on in Hong Kong, whatever, that the experiences around the world are very different, including what's happening with public transportation as a result of COVID. So let's just keep in mind that that our lens, I think that Adnan actually set this up at the beginning absolutely correctly, that this lens of our society, our culture, our economy, and actually, Fernando, I think that your terminology of the kind of privilege and agency aspects of this as well, super important part of this, that this is reflective of our culture. It is not universal. It is not being experienced the same way around the world. It's shining a mirror, it's holding a mirror up to us, and the picture is not pretty about our ability to deal with this. And I just want to say one more thing. I'm super involved with Indigenous cultures and trying to bring Indigenous cultures to the climate change conversation on an international level, try to get it into the IPCC conversation. And the kind of perspective that is being brought from that is that, just our culture here in the United States in 2021 is literally, it's at way one end of the spectrum of the disconnect that we're talking about here. And I think COVID has just been an amazing lesson to that. Who is failing? It's cultures that look like ours. Let's get to the bottom of that. It's very disturbing stuff. Let's not let this crisis be wasted on that analysis, because without a resilient community, without a resilient society, without a resilient culture, there's no other resilience. You have to start with a resilient culture.
I just make one comment about, to tack on to what Carl was just saying. I couldn't agree with you more that American culture in particular, Western culture more generally, is being indicted by COVID-19. And one of the challenges is that this is requiring collective response, that we have to actually prioritize not my individual will and what I want for me today in this moment, but we actually have to prioritize the collective needs of our communities more broadly. And culturally, that is not something that we have been taught to do. We have been taught to actually embrace our individualism in a way that has just the problem with that has just been completely revealed in this challenge. So Carl, I completely agree with your perspective.
We have another question here. What would the process be like, from Laura Redveld? What would the process be like to make more city streets into pedestrian walkways, particularly in areas with a lot of cafes, outdoor dining, and shopping districts? Could we model our cities to look more like European cities and create more social public space within existing streets without not displacing people through new construction? What is the process? What is the urban planning and legal process necessary to make this happen? What are the negative ramifications of this idea? So I kind of like that question to say, like, well, now how do we actually do this? So what would be some step? This is a specific question, but what?
Well, I can start a response to that. That's a process that has actually been underway for a while. If you think of the work of Janette Sadiq Khan in New York City a decade ago, the process of taking real estate away from vehicles and giving it back to people has been underway, needs to progress further and faster and do more. And now that we have some of the examples of the pandemic, perhaps that's even more possible. I think there are several issues. One comes back to the notion of resiliency and introduce one strategy, and one part of that is to introduce into the city as many trees as possible, as much plant material as possible, And so therefore, to take away lanes of traffic and introduce places for green, which cleans the air and lowers the temperature and all sorts of wonderful things, is one direction. There is an issue with separating spaces completely from automobiles. It's one thing to get the car to behave itself or drivers to behave themselves as they're space. And I'm sure you're all familiar with some of the efforts in Europe to eliminate all traffic signals so that people start seeing the experience of driving as one that you have to be responsible. There are no set rules, so you have to watch what's going on and see that people are there and then react as a driver just as you would as a pedestrian coming through spaces. But to eliminate cars completely, particularly in American culture, from urban spaces does not have a very successful history, nor does it in England, when many high streets were closed in the post-war period, only to go out of business. And it's not a matter of having giant amounts of traffic. It's a matter of having an additional set of activity going on in the street spaces. We were talking about Jane Jacobs earlier. She wrote an essay for a book called The Pedestrian in the City, which my partner David Lewis edited about 1963, 64, something like that. And it was a book filled with many examples of pedestrianizing cities. When they were first done, they appeared to be more successful than they ultimately wound up being. And her argument was, don't completely separate cars, but do it but let cars in, but in such a way that makes it that the cars behave and the pedestrian activity can dominate with that space. But I think there's enough movement in the country already to move in this direction. And again, it's another one of these waves that we can ride to create more public spaces in our cities.
If I can add a little bit to that, that is one thing that we did in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, in the last 20, 30 years, really, really well. We tackled the epidemic of smoking. And we did that by doing two things. One, we made the life of the smoker a little bit difficult. So if you live in a very warm weather or very cold weather, you have to go outside to smoke, and it's not as fun. And two, we took the glamour away from smoking. We started not publicizing it so much in movies, in TV, etc. We can do exactly the same for the automobile. We can make the life of the driver a little bit harder so that driving becomes less and less fun and more of a pain, which it is. And we desperately need to take the glamour away from driving. And that means facing a very strong industry that still have a major PR campaign of races and competitions and et cetera, but we need to do it. We did it for tobacco. We can do it for the cars.
I'd also just add that, there's also things where there are just total like low-hanging fruit opportunities, so the one right now that's COVID has brought us is acres and acres and acres of empty office space. There've been over the last month or so, a couple of articles in the New York Times about the level of commercial real estate in New York that's just sitting empty, and there's no expectation that it'll ever really get filled up again. Well, that vacuum, nature abhors a vacuum. That vacuum is going to probably get filled with housing, and you're going to start seeing all commercial office space buildings turned into mixed-use buildings, because those developers are not going to be wanting to sit on top of empty buildings. And there's a huge multiplier effect of the benefits that could come to cities for that to start to happen. I'll just leave it there.
how much time do we have left?
I mean, you can wrap it up. You know, I mean, if you find any more questions that are directed to any particular panelist, please feel free to direct the question to a panelist. Otherwise, we are pretty much at the end of our journey today.
Then I have one not very weighty question, but a question that I think is worth thinking about. You, in your article, Carl in his comments made distinctions about density, saying that density is clearly not, in and of itself, it's not the core issue here. Crowding, as Fernando pointed out, we have so many people living in one room, is the problem. The lack of the health services is the problem. But I think we, as a culture, have a public relations problem here because there is momentum behind the myth that density is the problem and the cause of disease. The real estate values in the suburbs of around New York City are skyrocketing, and I don't know, the residential real estate in New York is so resilient it'll probably survive. But that's definitely not. It's a false fact, and I know we're living in a post-fact world where facts don't seem to matter. But I think it's a challenge to figure out how to make it clear and to establish consensus and to publicize or whatever, proselytize the fact that density in and of itself is not a problem at all, but that in fact, properly designed higher density environments can be safeguards against these kinds of assaults in the future.
Tonya, do you see any other questions, or you wanna kind of close the Q&A?
There is one heavy question from Carlos Reimers about talking about the future of what the future of urban America could look like. So I just want to put it out there and see if there's anyone who has something they want to add. He says the last decades of migration patterns between suburbs and cities emphasis in sustainable development and search for livable dynamic environments led to reconsideration of better designed, more livable cities able to reduce commuting times to work, the volume of private car transportation, access to more diverse amenities, and the human benefits of socialization. The pandemic has not finished, and there are already reports that big corporations, we're touching on this already, are planning a reduction reaching up to 50% of their current office space due to the development of remote work and its consequent savings. In many cities, taxes from office space is the largest contribution to their income. In addition, people have found other ways to purchase goods, meet friends, and have a redefined going out less as a need and more as an opportunity to enjoy outdoors and nature. If we accept that there are a number of conditions that may lead to the reconsideration of suburban life as a better alternative in the near future, what do you think is the future of urban America?
So I'd like to just pick up on that, and relate it to what Ray was just talking about a minute ago. I think that a lot of that, what Carlos is observing there, is that what is it that we consider to be a sufficient environment in which to dwell? What, if the deal with cities until COVID-19 was that you might live in a little box, a little shoebox of a place, but you were on a street and you were in a city where there was all this other stuff. All of that stuff got taken away. All you were left was the shoebox, So if we're going to have that paradigm of, okay, really, what's your life in the shoebox going to be like? And I think we shouldn't forget that dimension of this. It starts to bring around things like, the vertical garden city, and, everybody's going to live in Singapore in the future, the idea that there's a different way to put together a modern city that is more biophilic, more humane, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not going to hold Singapore up as the like, that's it, we all ought to become Singapore, but it's probably the city that exists today in the world where there's been more different thinking for a longer period of time than any other city in the world. And it's very different. Living there, 85% of the people that live in Singapore live in public housing, and it's not slums. There's a different way to put a city together, and I would just point to Singapore and say that's it. So I think that I would actually really recommend Triumph of the City by Edmund Glaser and his Edward Glaser and his sort of perspective on this. He talks about Houston and that people that live in Houston are making a rational decision, and New York, and that people are living in New York are making a rational decision. There's a lot of different ways to live. And, but COVID took the city away, and there you were, all you were left with was with your shoebox. And that doesn't work very well. And oh yeah, well, I got left in my shoebox, but my shoebox has a front yard and a backyard. And that was all, I could take my dog for a walk. And that was a whole lot better than a shoebox where I had to get in an elevator and worry about I was going to get COVID every time I got in the elevator.
Any other comments from Rashida or Fernandez or Raymond?
Well, let's hope that the vaccination program will take hold and will work, and that the pandemic will be over at some point. Certainly, there will be other pandemics coming along at some point in the future, so we need to maintain our guard. But let's all hope that we can all come out of our shoeboxes and rejoin the city sometime within the near future. And I would think that will then change the dynamic again. Are there any, has anyone heard any numbers on the actual migration patterns that are happening? What I've heard is that it's not, that it's a two-way thing. There's still migration going both ways.
The number that I saw, Ray, as a consequence of the pandemic, it's a huge drop in the number of children being born all over the world. Huge drop in Europe, huge drop in the US, huge drop in Brazil. We're gonna have a baby bust in this year and next year. And that has also tremendous consequences for the future of cities.
All right, Tony, I think we are almost at the end of our time. Do you want to close out yeah, I think we have covered most of the questions. Do you have one more, any other question, or we should close?
I just want to remind everyone to check out if there's if you want to join the student AIAS after panel conversation, the link to the Miro is on the Miro board that's in the chat. So if you want to keep talking, go there.
Thank you, Tonya. I really appreciate it. Tonya, you've been good. You have been doing the, question Q&A moderation very well. You have done that in the past in our first panel. So I want to thank all our panelists. I think that's the time we have for our conversation. I want to thank Rashida, Ray, Carl, and Fernando for spending time with us. It's been fascinating, but I feel like we can go on for another 3 hours, talking about cities, because cities are never monolithic. There are so many things to talk about and so many ways to talk about cities, because cities are never one definable entity. Cities can be talked about from so many different angles. But unfortunately, that's the time we have. For attendees, please do not forget to sign up for AIA continuing education credits. Please, Julia has already told you how to send an email to get your AIA credits. Julia, do you want to put up the panel for next panel on pedagogy? Okay, so our next panel is on pedagogy in pedagogy in a post-pandemic world. So I'm sure you know that we are talking about architectural and urbanistic pedagogy in a post-pandemic world that will take place on April 12th. And I hope that you can join us. But before we close, I want to thank our panelists for a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for your insights, for your valuable comments. We really appreciate it. Your comments have given us much food for thought, and we will cultivate these insights in order to move forward. So thank you again for joining us here. I want to thank my colleague, Professor Tony Onstad, to moderate the Q&A. I also want to thank Julia Prior, who has been instrumental in organizing and managing this panel. And so thank you, Julia. And I also would like to thank Paula Riff, Dean's assistant, for organizing and facilitating to this panel and managing all the logistics about this panel. So again, I want to thank Ray, Rashida, Carl, and Fernando for an enlightening conversation. And I'm sure there is no conclusion. Cities are inherently contradictory and work in progress. So we can only talk with an ethos of work in progress, right? So, but I hope that in the end, together, despite our different political persuasions, different political motivations and orientations, not in the end, we can only hope for making the world a better place. No matter where we are, where we stand, how we view the world, I hope that together we can make this world a better place for everybody, not just for some people, but I hope that we can make the world a better place for all people. And that's what we can hope for. I thank you again for thanks to panelists and thanks to attendees, and good night. Thank you. Bye-bye.